Hello, I'm Peter Scott, and I'm the President and CEO of the Commonwealth of Learning. And I'm really grateful to have been given this opportunity to do a presentation to you today at your conference. I look forward to raising a few interesting issues with you and talking about a few interesting topics. My talk today is about AI in education. And as the President and Commonwealth of Learning, I've got a bit of a track record in some of these areas, in that I come from a background in artificial intelligence. I was a Professor of Knowledge Media at the Open University in the UK for around about 20 years. Then I moved to the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia, to take up a senior executive role in the university. And then I was the president of Athabasca University, Canada's Open University. I'm delighted now to be in the Commonwealth of Learning and really interested to share some of the work that we're doing with you today. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit about who COL is. Then I'll say a little bit about what we do. Then I'll dive in a bit into classical artificial intelligence to set a context for your conference, and then say a little bit about how the new forms of artificial intelligence that are the topic of your conference over the next 2 days look to me. And I hope that'll kick you off and set you going really, really well. One of the most important things I'll start with is to be clear that we're talking about AI not as a new form of intelligence or a new way to model thinking, but as something that's a tool. So not intelligence, just a tool. I would start, I think, below AI in the world of technology-enhanced learning. Ever since the pandemic, technology-enhanced learning has now become widely accepted to be a critically important part of the modern economy. Most analysts would consider pervasive technologies through smartphones and the internet as being something that radically changes the nature of our world. That, on top of the massive data that makes up the internet, the change in the nature of work and how work works, moves in generations and diversity, and now AI and cognitive computing, with a whole range of other changes, are starting to move into a world that is significantly more reliant upon that which is the digital. And education cannot remain immune from those changes. However, it's important to note that the analysts also accept that the world of artificial intelligence is pretty disrupted. The world in which we live is one filled with chronic problems in which education leaves behind many, many millions who are the disadvantaged, who are unable to even access forms of education. However, I'll note that these problems are not exactly new. They are chronic. We have known for a very long time that education has not been able to reach the disadvantaged in our world. And because of the nature of how we structure the cost of education, no amount of new schools, no amount of new buildings will address those chronic issues. Innovation is required to change the nature of how we teach and how we learn. And open learning is one of the great opportunities that is offered to us now to change that. The Commonwealth of Learning has that in its DNA. So who are we? Well, COL serves around about 2.5 billion people, being the peoples of the 56 nations of the Commonwealth. We're an intergovernmental organization. That's to say, we are owned and respond directly to the governments of those 56 countries. We are a small, agile operation running out of our headquarters in British Columbia and Canada, with also a base in India. And we operate under a memorandum of understanding with the Commonwealth, which was established in 1987. So we've been working for quite some years on the open agenda. The form of distance education that corresponds to open education, supported by collaborative work and the new technologies, and particularly the new digital, framed in a world of policy connected to the critical practices that help us to implement it. That's the recipe for COL. You'll be most familiar with us, I think, through the work that we've done in countries like the Maldives, where we've enabled mobile learning, working very closely with government and very closely with the institutions to transform the nature of countries at a time. Or where we've reached into India, where we've reached thousands and thousands of farmers working in the field to give adults in a working context a new view of how education can transform their lives. Or it is entirely possible that you'll be familiar with us from the vast number of courses that we run across the world, where we work with institutions and governments to create materials. We don't ever impose anything, but we work together with you in different countries to try and bring together lessons, materials, things that can be open, shared, and collaboratively produced to transform a specific issue which is relevant to that home community. Here, for example, some courses in youth work focused on the needs of the Pacific and done with a variety of different partners around the world, but with the Pacific as the owners of that, with the Pacific as the place in which the knowledge is local, and with the Pacific where the whole process of learning must be sustained. The way we do it really is to focus on a range of layers of interaction with key stakeholders. So we will work first directly with governments. Governments are very useful in that they support, they regulate, and they encourage change in their countries. So where that regulation supports new forms of quality, more open and more digital education, we're there to help governments create policies and to generate the capacity to lift their countries up. Primarily, most good governments do that through their institutions. So we will also work then directly with the institutions to help them to normalize the process of making education more accessible, reaching out beyond the bounds of a classroom, reaching out past the bounds of the institution towards pools of inequity to draw in those learners. We'll co-create and we'll collaborate together with them and other institutions to try and bring that access to those new learners. And where governments and institutions can't reach all the learners in their countries, we will try to reach directly through NGOs to learners in the field, in the context excluded from education. Our mission is to reduce disadvantage, to make it vanish, and we do that through innovation, not through simply taking conventional models and pumping more resources into them. Looking for something that has changed to allow us to make the big change for our planet. AI is the big new thing, which represents a big change in how technology can make a difference. So it's an obvious one for us. Find an innovation where something has changed, allows you to do something you couldn't previously do, allows you to find an opportunity to change it, and leverage that to the public good. I think it's very important for us to realize that we're talking here, and you'll be talking over the next couple of days, not about artificial intelligence as intelligence, not about general AI creating human minds or general cognitive science trying to understand human minds. That was an old field of mine, which I'm very proud of. I launched a brand new degree of cognitive science, which was a really powerful thing back in the 80s. But now we're looking at AI as an innovation in a tool set that allows us to do something that appears to be, to us, something that would have required human intelligence to do, but we're now able to get tools in machines to do those tasks. That's a really important distinction because people can get very easily confused and can very easily be fooled into thinking that they're looking at one thing which is intelligent, when actually they're looking at something which is simply a tool we should be levering for change. Joseph Weizenbaum's classical system from 1966, way back when, is a great example of that. Weizenbaum created a non-directive Rogerian therapist as a very simple model of pattern matching. The thing about non-directive therapists is they very rarely answer a direct question, and they very rarely pose a direct question. What they typically do is encourage you to disclose things. So ELIZA was a fantastic system using simple patterns to try and match the incoming input, which is the text typed into it from a user, and provide something that helped that user to continue the conversation. Using simple patterns, very simple probabilities, very simple tools and techniques, simple heuristics. If they say this, then you should say that. The thing that's interesting about Weizenbaum's system is it relies on simple pattern matching and probabilities, which is at the heart of what we're currently looking at. But it was so simple, he was blown away by how people overinterpreted its power. He has many examples of users and those who were encountering the system anthropomorphizing, believing that the system was actually having a conversation with them, when actually all it was ever doing was finding a pattern and then responding to get them to say something more. People, it seems, are very prone to this form of delusional thinking, where they can see intelligence where there is in fact just probability and pattern matching. I think that's a good model for us to think about, as we then see how education grew through those years to use artificial intelligence in some of the work that we were doing back then. I was in that field. It's my PhD. My early research work was on computer-assisted learning systems using very simple prompts to get a more digital world for learners, where we could collect data about them, where we could use that data to try and be a little bit more responsive. In the early days, it was limited pattern matching responses through drill and practice and multiple choice. Still a favorite of some teachers even today. That world moved into intelligent tutoring systems, which were heuristic. They again used if-then rules, just as the pattern matching did in ELIZA, but in a more sophisticated, modeled way. We had models of the fields that we were trying to get learners to navigate. There would be a model of what it meant to understand mathematics, a model of what we thought the key rules of diagnosis in medicine were. And the expert systems we created as intelligent tutoring systems, their job was to help you navigate that model and to model it yourself. A noble but ultimately still unfulfilled dream of that field. Behind it was personalization, trying to make the things that we do more personal to you, the learner, more supportive of you, the teacher, which is still a trend that I think is very, very honorable today. As we moved through into the 2000s and the 2010s, we got improved natural language interfaces, we got virtual learning environments with more powerful simulations, we could work with larger sources of data, and could actually then start to mine those sources of data of students' behavior as students were behaving in these digital systems. All of that provided extra patterns for us to start to model. And that created, in education, a machine learning field which was basically learning analytics. And that analytics could consume data of students' performance to try and make helpful predictions. My favorite systems in learning analytics from those days that are still continuing as a very noble field include work where learning analytics took large patterns of data to try and make predictions happen. So, for example, in this field, you'll see thinking about your learning and what it is you do as if it were a fingerprint. Imagine the formal pathway of a course as some sort of map, like a fingerprint. Fingerprint's a sort of map of your finger. And what you're trying to do as a learner is to traverse that map. Get through the swirls, get through the little barriers and the ridges from one end to the other. At one end, you enter trying to understand the course and what it is you're supposed to do. And at the end, you leave, having been assessed and having your competence demonstrated. If you think about it like that, this sort of map, then every learner will plot an individual path through that map. Sometimes the paths will diverge off the map and need to be brought back in. And if it reaches the end, you've succeeded. And if it wanders off the map, you have failed. I'd also note that the map is an interesting analogy because the maps we create of curriculum are certainly not made by learners. They're made by teachers. They're made by us, the institutions. And by the way, they typically map a journey, which we call curriculum, rather than an outcome, which we call a skill. That's really interesting, but probably the topic of a separate talk. So, one of my favorite systems in this vein was a system produced by the Open University in the UK and my old team at the Knowledge Media Institute. OU Analyze was an idea of Professor Stenningstrahl in the early 2010s, and it's still running, now being led by Professor Miriam Fernandez in the Open University's Knowledge Media Institute. It's now called the Early Alert Indicators Dashboard, and its job was to try to understand the fingerprint of success of a large number of users having created that map and take an individual user and predict what their next step will be through the pathway and help them to make the best step that someone like them who's following that pathway would make to be successful, to remain inside the map and not wander outside it and fail. So, how does it do that? Well, it does that with a large amount of data. It's crunched all of the data of previous students, and every time a cohort of students completes, it gets smarter and smarter with respect to understanding how students navigate that map. That means for any given student, their next action is correlated with all other students who've done the same thing. Not only that, you can then narrow it down to students who are not generically the students who traverse the pathway, but students who are a bit like the current student. So you can give advice to a student based on a prediction of other students who are a bit like them. Much more personal than any generic system. So how does that work? It works by looking at the learner's demographics, looking at the learner's performance, and mapping through their performance to make predictions. And from those predictions, you can then intervene. An intervention might be a phone call, a text chat. It might be a recommendation for a reading. Something that a student who is like them could do to be more successfully traversing that pathway. The great thing about this system is it was created, 14 or so years ago, and it is still working. You can't say that of many systems that we create in the world, but OU Analyze, now the new dashboard, has very good predictive quality. A recent study published in the Learning Analytics Conference in 2023 noted that it is now fully rolled out, being pretty effective, but still not fully used by the university, which is, by the way, another lesson. No matter how clever the system, no matter how important its evident success, it has to be used and it has to work in line with policy to be fully effective. So OU Analyze, the new learning analytics dashboard of the Open University in the UK, is kind of classical AI, still using large correlational databases, but focused on one very specific task that isn't as such leveraging language. Now, the LLM revolution comes along and the landscape changes. Large language models are focused on, consuming incredibly large amounts of data. Instead of just the data from a few thousand students, an LLM can consume masses of data from the internet. So it's not too surprising that those correlations from that massive amount of data can lead to much more interesting outcomes. LLMs can produce essays, articles, tweets, language translation, text summarization, and even small courses. The key is to ask a good question. If you can frame a complex enough question to narrow down the search data that you're looking for correlations in, you'll get a much higher quality response from the tool. At the heart of LLMs is language. Generative AI using the language analysis models with large amounts of text data, which is pretty universal and pretty common, with all of the rules of language helping us to constrain how we think about things connecting to each other, and very large correlational databases. You can also, where it can be described by language, use image, video, and text. Sorry, audio. Obviously, you can use text. Sure. One of the things that's most interesting to us in the Commonwealth of Learning is open source. We believe that the best way to achieve impact in our world is to share it and collaborate with it. And the best thing you can do there is to make it open. Whilst there are some really powerful proprietary models, starting with ChatGPT, we're now seeing a series such as from the Facebook family Meta and from Microsoft of models that are made available to the community via open source. And like you will be hearing in the next couple of days, the power of the model is typically described in how many billion parameters. Emerging applications overall include things like customer support, healthcare, marketing, advertising, entertainment, and music industry. I would say that educational chatbots actually make up a large proportion of the chatbot market. And here we can see a customer support bot or a medical report analyzer, or even something that can generate a little bit of music and script and art, is a very powerful way to save a significant tools to save time in each of these new scenarios and new marketplaces. For education, those include things like virtual tutoring, the chatbots, as I've already mentioned, and anything that can personalize learning a little bit more than the more generic, this is what everyone else does, that a textbook does. A textbook takes you on a generic journey. Once that is made more digital, and we can use large correlations to help you understand your navigation through the space created by that text, we can provide something just a little bit more personal, just a little bit more for you, and just a little bit more adaptively tuned to your requirements. Two of the interesting areas to mention are in examining and in administration. Possibly not the most exciting of areas, but areas that can really help in an academic world make the work of an academic much more efficient. Where you can grade a paper, apply a rubric, and give feedback in a very fast way, in a very efficient way, you can start to scale your experience of working with large numbers of digitally mediated learners. And where you can find a simple way to improve an administrative task to take time that you could otherwise be spending teaching, you can certainly make any academic or teacher's life easier. One of the best examples, I think, comes from Australia and my good friends at the University of Technology, Sydney. Here, Professor Simon Buckingham-Shum shows an example of a bot which helps academics to think about their course-intended learning outcomes. A silo, a course-intended learning outcome, is something that helps to describe the nature of the learning that a student will do when they have completed a course. So the silo bot helps you as an academic working on the course to more elegantly describe the nature of the student's experience with respect to those learning outcomes. Simon's team took the UTS course handbook, which describes the courses, where each course is captured in course-intended learning outcomes. Here, for example, the Bachelor of Sport and Exercise Management has 26 of these things. There are things that say, for example, when you have completed the course, you'll be able to lead, manage, and inspire within the fields of sport. You will be able to demonstrate leadership to individuals, groups, and organizations. You'll be able to assess and manage safely the risk appropriate to the client and context in sport and exercise management. So these are really useful things that not only help a student to think what they will learn and an employer to understand what the student with this degree has learned, but for you as the course designer and manager to ensure that what you do delivers on these things. This is part of your contract with your learner, that they will have these outcomes. So a good set of course-intended learning outcomes is really, really valuable. Where your SiloBot can help you is to simplify that task. And here, SiloBot suggests that the 26 course-intended learning outcomes of this particular bachelor's degree really should be a lot less, that there are only a small number of them. The way the SiloBot was designed was quite important. It was created through a hackathon, that's to say a project workshop amongst academics, learning designers, and learning analytics researchers. They used some very simple taxonomies, simple pedagogies such as Bloom's taxonomy, to help determine what they were really looking for in the outcomes. They included specific requirements that are suited to Australia, such as an Indigenous course-intended learning outcome, and the preliminary results were validated by external experts. The significant saving here is that what would normally have taken at least 3 hours with a large team of academics led by a course director to refine course-intended learning outcomes to the simplest and most powerful now takes around about 30 seconds, saving a lot of very difficult and complex negotiations in the team and a lot of time. And you can imagine very clearly a whole range of bots to help simplify academic tasks in this way. Many universities are doing such things. In most such universities, a large language model is even being hosted inside the university to give the university significantly more control over the work they want to do. Typically, that's setting up a local institution installation and having some boundaries around it so that the institution can protect its use of its own data and decide which, if any of its data, will be exposed to models from the outside world. All of these LLMs rely on feeding upon data, and when they have consumed that data, they wish to use it for other things. Any institution, any business, any university, any school may choose to keep that data more closed in order to manage potential surprising uses of it by third parties. So in the process, most universities are also developing guidelines and rules about how to create their own models for universities, how to create their own bots and tools to help support them, and how to manage the cost and performance of doing such things. A good example is from America, the Arizona State University. So, for example, ASU has a number of very good guidelines which help to capture their own installation in OpenAI, with around about 200 projects creating bots, all visible at Arizona State University's site. You can see some of the case studies all the way from helping academics to write research grants, all the way down to visualizing data and creating tools to help historians. Michigan is another good example in the US. Self-hosted LLM services with inclusion, equity, and access at the heart of how that university is embedding these systems, and a range again, probably not quite as many, but a range again of thoughtful systems to try and help academics to understand how to use these LLM AI bots and systems to save time, create value for learners, and support their own work. The thing that's interesting for me about the Michigan case study is that they've got a very strong ethical standpoint, as indeed as Arizona State, as indeed is any university that is working in this field, start with ethics, but also start by thinking creatively and innovatively about what you're even trying to do. In this case, for example, one of the things I thought was pretty good about how Michigan had approached the topic of examining was to see in their assignment decision tree guiding academics about the nature of examining, they're asking very clearly that academics focus on authentic assessment that can't be replaced or done by a bot. And there's a sense in which, very clearly, if the answer that you're seeking from a learner could have been created artificially, if a bot could have answered that question as well or better than a student, then you should rethink the assignment. How about using the opportunity of AI support for assessment to help you even think a bit about how you are properly assessing your learners? I like that. I think it's a very good perspective, fitting in very well with the need to be creative about how you manage how to assess. It is the case that most nations are now looking very hard at their own guidance about these things. So, for example, again, in the Australian context, which I'm pretty familiar with, the regulator TEXA, in thinking about how academics should approach the design of their assessments and what the principles should be in reforming how you assess learners at an appropriate quality level, has come up with a series of guiding principles and propositions to ensure that all of the Australian institutions are thinking about such questions. Internationally, I would say that there are some very strong movements now to help think about that ethical thing with respect to how AI is being used well. And one of the most influential is the Beijing Consensus, which helps us think a little bit about how to ensure that educators are fully in the loop of what we do in the AI that we produce. One of the most critical elements of learning and teaching is that it is a very human process. And that means that teachers and students should be involved very closely in the things that we do together to improve learning. We're not trying to replace teachers with machines. We're trying to augment the human process so that teachers are fully empowered to be in the loop of controlling and managing that with the appropriate tools at their fingertips, where those tools are fully conversant with the new data-driven correlational strength of AI tools that we can now create. Those need to be created with them and with learners as well in that compact. COL is creating a range of systems itself, of course, and you'll see some of those coming in the next year or so. We've already run a few trials, and keeping the teacher in the loop, keeping the teacher fully involved in the process, keeping teachers, governments, and institutions fully aligned with all of these new developments and unafraid of how those developments will impact upon them is incredibly important to us. So a new piece of work you'll be seeing over this next year is described by us as keeping the teacher in the loop of AI. We've already created a range of pilots of that framework. For example, here we created a simple help desk to help teachers to be able to very quickly and effectively answer students' queries through the use of a bot, where they're part of the loop of that, where the bot's answers are insufficient. But really able to scale up their performance, scale up how they did things, and having a large number of students express satisfaction with that work. Most importantly, I think, is that open source and ethics has to be at the heart of what we do with Gen AI. Moving forward, the best way for us as educators and our obligations to our learners is to ensure that both being as open as we can be and starting ethically at the heart of all of the work that we do. So, broadly speaking, LLMs in education definitely offer an exciting promise. And you'll be seeing over the next couple of days in all of the talks that I've seen that are in your program, that Gen AI has some very exciting things to offer us. It's very important that we use that promise with care and involve faculties, teachers, mentors, and learners in the loop of learning. It's important that we quality check the work that we do and that we comply with good national regulations. Also, I'd note that there are a lot of challenges in the field. AI isn't always accurate. The responses we get are correlational. They are nothing to do with meaning. They are simply correlations with things that are likely to be the case. And those correlations must be cross-checked before they're used. It's also the case that the systems are often pretty insensitive to a local context. They're generated out of the large amount of data that comes out of the internet, which typically comes from a small number of countries, and therefore they aren't aware of your national context unless you are tuning the systems using your national data. So training and fine-tuning to get national contexts and your local context there is incredibly important. It's also important to look after your data. As I've said, many institutions are building their own models and localized models in order to ensure that data doesn't flow out into the general internet, where it could be unethically used by a third party. So when you're using a cloud service free, cheap cloud services, beware that your data can be crossing national boundaries, and that could be a concern for the data sovereignty of your work. But I'd also say learners have an obligation in this field to influence it. It's something that I think is very important that we consider very seriously. There are very few well-trained AI experts in government, and we have to try to create an opportunity to get more of those. And we also have to support regulation. So organizations like the Commonwealth of Learning are making it a priority to ensure the governments of the Commonwealth are supported to think through how to get into these areas and start with them. Because education has to be at the heart of a number of the key scenarios that drive this, not just economic benefit. Start with transparency and start by providing a safe and managed environment where teachers and learners can be more in control of what it is the bots you create and the bots that you use are doing. Also, I'd say not only is this an obligation, but it's also quite exciting in terms of opportunities. One of the valuable features of the Commonwealth is that there are 56 nations who can share things, who can collaborate, who can come together to share best practice. So sharing that experience, sharing the work we do together as faculty, staff, and developers is really, really important. And also bringing policy and practice together, which is at the core of what the Commonwealth of Learning does, is really, really important to be successful in this area, to ensure that we foster inclusive and ethical approaches to all of these new systems. Overall, I would say that AI in its current form is an exciting, dangerous-looking tool that teachers and learners must be in charge of to control and manage the future of education. But it's also exciting because it gives us an opportunity to change the chronic landscape of disadvantage. And any tool that helps us to break open that and try new approaches, try new things to reach beyond our bounds is something that has to be seen as exciting and an opportunity. Finally, I will gaze a little into the crystal ball as we are wont to do. Part of a talk like this is to basically introduce what is going to be an exciting couple of days of work for you, looking at some of these key areas in a bit more detail, but also to look a little bit into our future. I think the future is bright, exciting, but not without its dangers. We have to recognize those dangers and find ways that we can come together to solve them. What that largely means is thinking a little bit about the, as it were, virtuous cycle from open systems where we have collaborated together to change the landscape with innovation, create appropriate regulation, and then cycle around again to iterate and improve. And in everything, the elephant in the room is digital and technology. And today, it's AI. As you come to consider that elephant, I will invite you to also, once you're through your conference, bring your work to Botswana. We will be next year, 10th to 12th of September 2025 in Botswana, with our own Pan-Commonwealth Forum on innovative open education. The Pan-Commonwealth Forums are an opportunity for us to come together to weave policy and practice with folk from government, folk from industry, and educators and practitioners to ensure that we're bridging all of those gaps and bringing those ideas together. So I'll thank you again for inviting me to do this presentation. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really sure that you're going to have an exciting couple of days as you dive deeply into how AI will impact upon your practice. And from the Commonwealth of Learning here in Vancouver in Canada, I wish you well and thank you again.